Welcome. Welcome to another PhilanthroThink, hosted by Carleton's Philanthropy Nonprofit Leadership Program, the only graduate program of its kind in the country serving the philanthropic and nonprofit sector. I'm Susan Phillips, professor in the program and in the School of Public Policy and Administration. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Carleton University is situated on the traditional, unceded, and unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin Nation. No matter where you are, we encourage all of us, as settlers, immigrants, and their descendants, and as visitors, to honor and respect the many Indigenous peoples of our locales and work toward a more just future together. As noted, this session is being recorded for future educational purposes. Well, it's certainly been an eventful day with tariffs announced on Canada and Mexico and reciprocated by our country, capping off a turbulent period. When we started planning this session on U.S. developments in philanthropy a month or so ago, frankly, we didn't anticipate how fast new things would come at us. Indeed, initially, we thought we might be talking about the implications for foundations of, say, the Harvard case on targeted programming, or Vice President Vance's reported views on philanthropy, where he once referred to some of the major U.S. foundations as cancers on society. Since then, we have cuts to U.S. aid, among other developments. So there's been much in the way of public policy coming from the U.S., but we also want to address trends and developments that are not products of policies, but that are broader trends within the philanthropic and nonprofit sector. There's certainly great interest, with more than 300 people registered for this event. And we have a great panel, a panel of an outstanding researcher and observer of such matters in the US, and two astute Canadian sector leaders. My introductions will be very brief to ensure we provide adequate time for substance. First, Ben Soskis is a historian, PhD American History from Columbia, and journalist. He's a senior research associate at the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. Among many other contributions and accomplishments, Ben is a regular contributor to the Chronicle of Philanthropy and co-editor of HistPhil, a web-based publication devoted to the history of the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors, and I highly recommend it to you. Malcolm Burrows has over 30 years of experience. He started as a child, admittedly, as a philanthropic advisor and gift planner in Canada. He's head philanthropic advisory services at Scotia Wealth Management, and founded and leads Aqueduct Foundation, a public foundation with donor-advised funds, the 13th largest foundation in Canada. As a volunteer, Malcolm has been a director of the Metard Foundation, Canada Helps, among others. In short, Malcolm has an inside view of the Canadian philanthropic landscape and its future. And third, Jean-Marc Majon is president and CEO of Philanthropic Foundations Canada and a member of our MPNL Advisory Council. Among his previous experience, Jean-Marc worked for many years in international development, an area particularly affected by what's happening south of the border. So Ben, we turn it over to you to give us a sense of what's happening in the US, both policy-wise and broader trends within the sector. And then we'll open it to discussion of what might be influenced here in Canada. So welcome.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here. And I should say, just off the start, I come in peace, which is not necessarily assumed these days. I'm going to just give a very basic overview of what I see happening vis-a-vis philanthropy and the latest developments from the Trump administration. We can talk about broader trends. all those trends, I think, are now being reshaped and transformed by what's happening vis-a-vis the administration. I should say I'm not a lawyer, I'm a historian, so I think about these things with a kind of broader historical perspective. And so the question that I like to think about is what is actually new in the current moment. And we can say a couple of things about what is not new. So it is not new, at least in from the perspective of recent American history, that administrations would target particular nonprofits that it associates with its own partisan or ideological opposition. And it's not new that an administration would look to the nonprofit sector for an opportunity to cut budgets, to cut the budget. We've seen both of this in the past during the Reagan administration and subsequent administrations even after that. So what is new? So what I think actually is new is that the entire nonprofit sector has been framed by this administration in oppositional terms. There is a posture of distrust as a default for the sector as a whole. And the nonprofit sector, as opposed to particular components within it, are now considered to be one of a series of institutions like the administrative state, like the press, like the academy, that are assumed to be corrupt and arrayed against the will of the people as expressed and understood by a populist leader. And this is happening at a moment when, somewhat paradoxically, or perhaps not paradoxically, the nonprofit sector, philanthropy, and the state are as intertwined as they've ever been in terms of public-private partnerships, in terms of federal funding. Research from my own institution, the Urban Institute, shows that 27% of nonprofits in a representative panel study that we do receive federal grants. And the average nonprofit receives about a quarter of its funding from government. So nonprofits are now deeply entwined with the state. The other kind of novel dimension is that the Trumpian right does not have a kind of countervailing affirmative theory of civil society or voluntarism to mitigate the disruption that it's causing. Disruption is a sort of end in itself. And this is, if you look at back at the history of conservatism, this really is different. In the past, even if conservative administrations promoted policies that damage the bottom line of nonprofit institutions or threaten philanthropy, the assumption was that civil society would somehow be empowered in the long run. We have no 1,000 points of light. We have no compassionate conservatism now. What we're seeing, whether it's with the cuts, the basic across the board cuts from the Office of Management and Budget to all nonprofits receiving federal funding, the abolition of USAID, the targeting of DEI in nonprofits internally and as part of their programs, or the slashing of the National Institute of Health overhead rates to 15%, which would reduce funding of research dramatically. In all these cases, the assumption is that the disruption itself will be salutary, not that it would eventually empower the civil society. One more novel element worth highlighting, and that is one that's really characterized the right's attitudes towards progressive philanthropy and nonprofits more generally. And this is a kind of blurring between a targeted and a generalized critique, which I think has amplified the disruption even further. What we get is a kind of entanglement between what I call remedial and punitive reform, meaning that there are very legitimate concerns about philanthropy, about the size of endowments, about payout rates, about transparency, that are being invoked but they are applied in a targeted way, directed towards ideological enemies. And this itself is I think a kind of novel spin on elements that we've seen in the past historically. I want to highlight a few elements of what I just mentioned, and I'll pass it on to my colleagues. One, something that's really struck me in what's come out of the Trump White House is the way in which nonprofits have been almost described as a foreign force. And this I think has deep implications to philanthropy. In one of the White House memos, Trump called nonprofits NGOs. This is not a term that is generally used in the U.S. It's a term that is almost entirely used in the kind of development space, but it's very closely associated with the struggles between authoritarian regimes and nonprofits and community service organizations that challenge them. I think there's an assumption that philanthropy and nonprofits are alien institutions with respect to the state, and that is I think a really that has deep implications about how philanthropy responds to this crisis, trying to demonstrate. It puts the onus on philanthropy to sort of demonstrate its own rootedness in communities, its democratic legitimacy. But also there's an association with philanthropy and what might be considered alien ideologies, this idea of a woke culture or DEI. And it's there's been a real effort to sort of hone in on that as the element of a kind of corrupting influence across all of civil society. Another really striking dimension is the use of fear as an instrument of governance. In one of Trump's early executive orders, he required all federal agencies to identify up to 9 potential investigations of corporations, large nonprofits, or foundations with assets of 500 million or more. He didn't specify what these organizations were. He just sort of there's now a general assumption that if you are a large philanthropy, you potentially could be under investigation, and it's had a dramatic chilling effect on the sector as a whole. I'm sure many of you who are observers of the sector have experienced that directly. It's been an extremely effective, without actually initiating any of those investigations. As of now, as far as I know, none have been initiated publicly. It's really managed to chill a lot of the work, and I think there's a strategic question about what the proper response is for philanthropy to that. I'll end. There's a whole bunch of things that we can talk about. I think two quick points to end. One is there are some really legitimate questions of reform potentials that Susan mentioned before the administration began. One of the questions I was most interested in was, could this actually be a moment in which the left and right come together on a number of philanthropic reform issues, such as endowment reform, questions about transparency, questions about payout rates, questions about donor advised funds. It's unclear what the status of those reform issues are. As you mentioned, Vice President Vance has been probably the proponent of the most aggressive reforms suggested in policy, including payout rates of up to 20%. It's a real strategic conundrum what reformers should do in the moment, because if many of those reforms are targeted, at least from the administration's perspective, towards particular viewpoints that are considered problematic, do you lean into those reforms? Do you try to figure out a way to find common ground, or is the whole reform discussion now should it be suspended in this moment? The final thing is sort of what the role of philanthropy should be in this moment. This is a subject of enormous debate, and I'm not going to pretend to have a definitive answer. There's a couple of points at which the debate really hinges on. One is, should philanthropy lean in and cover, even knowing that it has nothing near the resources of the federal government, should it try to do what it can to fill in some of the gaps? Or does that legitimize and facilitate the cuts themselves? And does it make philanthropy even more democratically suspect? Enormous debates surrounding that. The second is a question of leadership. Philanthropy has been particularly targeted as a suspect by this administration. And I think you can look at it in a number of different ways. There's an argument, which is that this is a moment for philanthropy not to lead, but to generally be circumspect and let community-based organizations that are deeply rooted in grassroots and constituent-led movements do the leading as a kind of as a way to push back on some of the challenges from this administration. The other theory is that this is precisely the moment philanthropy should be leading, because they are some of the strongest and most well-resourced organizations in the U.S. And I should say, just as an observer, it's not clear which of those two sides is now kind of has dominance. But it's one that is a topic of daily conversations, and I'd love to get your panelists' thoughts and hear what you guys have to say. Happy to follow up with anything afterwards. And again, thanks for inviting me here.
Great. Thank you, Ben. You've given us so much to think about, and some of the issues are longstanding in Canada. Do we have a narrative for the sector? Who leads? Do we have the kind of leadership we need? So we'll hear from first Malcolm and then Jean-Marc with sort of the Canadian implications and developments, and then we'll have a chat. Malcolm, over to you.
Thanks so much, Susan. And Ben, thank you for your comments. Being north of the border, it's hard to fully appreciate the implications being in the midst of it. We're a little bit removed and very concerned. I wanted to break it down to sort of three sort of topic headings. I see the current moment as a very fundamental shift in, like Ben, in sort of the perception of the nonprofit and charitable sector. And my first sort of observation is very simply politics trump charity. And it's this one of the things that this relates to rule of law. We've had a generally agreed upon notion of categories of public good and in the broader charitable and nonprofit. And that trust for charities has been very high, and it's deeply rooted in the American tradition. I think of somebody, Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville. It's it's civil society, it's volunteerism, it's this is not alien, this is absolutely fundamental. And then around it, you have statutory common law definitions of what's charitable. And it's always been a dialectic with political, but what politics is outside. It's always interfering. There's always end runs. There's always disagreements about what we define as public good. But there's been this broader category over time that's been accepted, and that's reflected through registration system and all. And to Ben's point, what we're seeing now is a complete dismantlement of this. So you have, Trump proxy like Elon Musk saying that not-for-profits are bogus, they're radical left, they're making money off the homeless, and government outsourcing, any kind of payments. It's just involving shady and illegal deals. I mean, the extraordinary elevated rhetoric here is just like, where does it come from? And fundamentally, you have a regime here that's about power and politics, and they don't believe, to Ben's point, in altruism, in voluntary action, in sort of public good, except for how they define it. And so you see this exercise of increasingly sort of, at least in deference to the president, absolute power. And a lot of, as we saw with Zelensky on Friday, this disrespect. It's just a mafioso kind of thing. It's a bad movie. And this disrespect, and what doing is this is enabled by this process of undermining public trust in things we've always depended upon, in norms. And charity law, second point, is what we're seeing is these norms overruled. And there's been generally a widespread support. As I said, there's always disagreements about how best to carry out action. But you look at 27% of receiving some kind of federal fund or government funding. This is deeply embedded, but here, and it crosses, it's international NGOs, development organizations, educational institutions, and philanthropies like foundation. But we are now experiencing this extraordinary populist political backlash. Charities are viewed as foreign, they're viewed as elitist, which is fundamentally, doesn't represent all of the hundreds of thousands of entities in the US, or for that matter in Canada. And so there's this shockingly direct attack where as Ben points out, I mean, a lot of these are sort of executive actions, gestures, threats. It's muscle, but obviously it's dismantling of USAID aid. 50% of international aid funding. We're talking, this is not a political issue. This is about people starving. This is about, hundreds of millions of dollars in food aid and basic sort of primary health care. It is so systemic and is so intertwined. And this xenophobia associated with it, this deep sort of rooted xenophobia, talking about taxes on universities, endowment, talking to US university colleagues, the fear, indirect costs of research are being cut, for example, obviously around DEI and the scrubbing of websites and this dismantling of research funding, talk about tax on major foundations as well, not to mention a complete dismantlement of environmental funding, regulation, the oversight that keeps these things intact. So one of the things that I'm most concerned about as a Canadian is this interconnectivity, and also to Ben's point about the funding mix. Back in the 80s, because I'm been around for a while, I remember Reagan's cutback. And I actually think that although I was reflecting on this, and there's a recent Chronicle Philanthropy article about the Reagan cutbacks. And Ben's point, I think, is spot on. At least that government, that regime believed in civil society. They believed in community. It doesn't exist anymore. And the big mantra at the time was, it's not about government funding. Philanthropy will lead the way. Philanthropy will replace. And in many ways, it unlocked the philanthropic moment we've been in ever since. It's unlocked tax changes and endorsements, things like that. And that has affected our Canadian environment very significantly. But yet fundamentally, it's false rhetoric. Philanthropy is an important source of funding, but it's not a sole replacement source of funding. This is completely false rhetoric. The numbers don't add up, and we'll be able to certainly plug some gaps, and there's going to be some organizations that are all right. But this isn't something we need to understand, that the healthy nonprofit, charitable, not-for-profit world needs to have a healthy funding mix. We need to look at government funding, direct, indirect. We need to have donors. We need to have earned revenue. What's happening in education in Canada right now, because of the loss of international funding, international student funding, is really underscoring this here. And it's also going to be in endowments and foundations. We can't just throw out any one of these legs of the stool. We have to look at it sort of overall. One of the things that I was very struck by is ideologically, you'd think that there would be certain alignments, but back again to Ben's point, that this is a government that's, or a president anyways, that is not interested in the sector, views it as something that's hostile. So the USAID funding cutbacks, one of the entities that it's ended up affecting is World Vision. International evangelical organization, 44% of their funding comes from USAID right now. That is, and if you look at the Canadian World Vision numbers, how much of that's actually come across the border. And so there's this interrelatedness about charities. We're connected in this international world. That's it's research funding, it's government funding, and there's ideas as well. Just the same way that Reagan's notion of philanthropy is going to carry the day, that moved to Canada and affected policy. It affected culture, and it was a different moment politically. But I'm very worried about we think we could look at the south of the border and say this is going to be contained there. We have very, very little sympathy for it here, but I don't think we are isolated or insulated from either the rhetoric or the funding cut, because there's so much interrelationship of entities, fundings, aspirations, and ideas in North America.
Thank you, Malcolm. A good way to connect and remind us that we're not insulated or isolated. Jean-Marc, you spend your time in the foundation world, in institutional philanthropy and all of its connections. What do you see as some of the implications?
I'd like to react to some of the comments of Malcolm and Benjamin's first, and then I'll just answer your question afterwards. Is that I've yet to see that toxic narrative about the Trumpian narrative about philanthropy finding its way in Canada. But Malcolm is totally right. We're not immune, to propaganda and disinformation. But my interaction with the Conservative Party, which is embraced very much a populist approach, they have a positive view about civil society, about philanthropy. So so within the other than a few odd voices, that this narrative has yet to take hold. And what strikes me right now is the level of unity across the country, across the political families, about the fact that Canada is under direct economic attack from this administration. And today is a historic day in that process. The chaos, the cruelty, the unpredictable behavior, the kind of destruction of the institution, they're all both part of the strategy, but also ends by themselves. And it's really, I think Canadians are right to be frightened and anxious about what that moment means, but I also see a great sense of like, nobody's coming to our rescue. Can't count on the Brits. Can't count on the French. We're very much left with our own device, and perhaps over the years we were a little. We took the American shadow for granted, and did not make the kind of investment that this country needs. And now I think there's a great sense of convergence across the country, that the national government, regardless of its political leaning, is going to invest into national defense, is going to try to protect to the best it can our economic security, and this will have some real costs on our collective well-being. And it's going to be different from COVID. the sectors they're giving the shape of our economy. The sectors that are more export oriented tend to be male dominated, and they tend to be well-paying jobs. So that's very different from what we experienced during COVID. But the shock will be felt across society. So and the capacity of both the federal and provincial government to sustain our social safety net is very much become very much under strain. It's already, I mean, as Malcolm mentioned, part of the system, education and health and the arts, is being held together by tape right now. So and it's only through the education of those working in these sectors that the system are functioning. So imagine more pressure on it. And I'm also hearing some talk about kind of bailout philanthropy, and I don't think it's a very useful concept for Canada. It's not realistic. Like if you look at the math simply doesn't work. We have about $135 billion of assets managed by 10,000 foundation, providing about $10 billion of grant a year right now. That's only 36% of what government spends on health every year. If you only look at childcare, the new programs are being rolled out, that's nearly $10 billion a year. So essentially the level of granting that's being done by all foundations of all issues. If you look at the dental program that the federal government has rolled out over the last year, that's $4.4 billion. That's nearly half of the granting that's provided. So for me, it's like the math that doesn't work, but there's still some less. I mean, one of the best, and Benjamin probably knows it a lot more than I do. The best case study of bailout philanthropy is a great grand bargain in Detroit in 2014, where large foundations came together, worked with the private sector, with the different levels of government, and put a stabilization program in place. It was time bound. And provide new money for Detroit to get back on his feet, but that still costs over $1 billion Canadian dollars to do that from the philanthropic actors doing that exercise, and Canadian philanthropy does not have the kind of the such large players that could provide that on a specific issue. However, I still think that the level of ambition and level of imagination and the blending of granting and investment, there's some lessons learned there that could be relevant at how we approach in our philanthropic strategies over the next few years, because there's going to be real pressure on the overall system, and every foundation will need to be as generous as they can be. And there's a spectrum of legitimate option to consider. Some may decide to go all in to say, well, this is a rainy day that we've planned for, and our country is under so much pressure that we will spend down within a 5 and 10 year period. Others may decide that a blended strategy, that you put part of spend out part of the endowment, but you protect the rest, so be able to stay engaged on long-term issues. And others that are working on youth mental health, on climate issues, on building an indigenous-led economy. These are long-term structural reform issues that will take 15, 20, 25 years of work. And to be able to keep working on these issues with your partners over that period of time, and these I think are all legitimate. So in that respect, I think simply increasing the DQ is a simplistic solution to this, because it closed down the flexibility and the option of those who want to stay engaged over the long term to do so. And if you look at numbers, already we're probably at 7.3, 7.4%. We're exceeding the floor of the 5% as an overall system. So to one of the aspects that I think is embraced by throughout the country is that having 10,000 foundation, I mean, these points of light, I think, is in the tie that bind us as a society. There's something real there, and that but every foundation has to consider what the implication of this crisis means to their work, and the different foundation will come to different choices. So the other aspect is that there will be a lot more pressure across different elements of traditional foundation activity in terms of emergency support response, much greater needs. We already seeing it as some of the social ills facing the country have worsened in recent years. There's a protection of long-standing initiatives that are serving Canadians, and again in the art and social services and education that still needs work to continue. And then that work about kind of what some people like to refer as structural change and system change, that does like imagining what kind of long-term solution to address these issues. These are all relevant pathways for philanthropy. No foundation is hard to be active on all three elements of this, given the resources that you're facing, and giving the scale of the issues that policy element is, I think, is investing in the policy capacity of your partners to affect change, whether they involve in the emergency and on structure, on protection. There's going to be a lot of reimagining that's required, and we have a very modest think tank community in Canada that has received some philanthropic support, but it's fairly marginal. So just to finish, the hour of philanthropy, I think, remains very important. The flexibility around funding, long-term funding as much as possible, building capacity and leadership and organization. These kind of principles that have been tested during COVID and have worked very well. Many foundations have maintained those to this point. So the hour of philanthropy is important. The part I think is going to take more than we did during COVID is the part around policy work and around the investment strategies of foundation. We've struggled as a community to achieve we're not yet at 10% impact investment by public and private foundation when we look at the latest investment survey. And it's going to be a great deal of pressure to invest in Canada in an economy where the prospect of uncertainty, so that tends to dry up investment, so that working with government to try how we can manage risk effectively to encourage investment in this context. That's going to be a big hill to climb, but I think it's an important hill to climb as part of a responsible investment strategy that's being managed by each foundation. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Jean.
Yeah.
You've brought us nicely round circles. So we'll have a conversation among us. If you have questions as the audience, please put them in the Q&A, and one of our team will be monitoring them and sorting them out. Ben, you mentioned some of the more radical options that are being considered: dismantling the threat to dismantle some of the progressive foundations, raise the payout rate to 25%. How likely is that? I mean, it's always hard to predict, but do you see that as an idle threat or a real threat? And if even part of it happen, what would be the impact on Canada? We've recently gone through our own policy change where the annual distribution quota moved to 5%. We had a vigorous discussion about it. But if it were much more in the US, that would create perhaps a different conversation here.
Well, one thing I think I've learned over the last couple of weeks is not to try to prognosticate about anything that's going on. So I'm going to punt on that one. But let me just make the more important point. the function of these kind of threats is not necessarily contained within their actual implementation. The threat itself has an important role. It's already doing work, and so I think there might be a whole host of policy moves that come out of this administration that could have far-reaching implications for the sector, but even absent them, and you'll see that so far the administration has not really moved through Congress. It's been done through almost entirely through executive actions. These types of policies would have to go through Congress, but there's a lot of disruption that can be caused. The overhead rate reduction to 15%. Would result in something like $36 billion less of funding to research institutions. I think if there was targeted payouts or endowment taxes, it would have there's no doubt it would be the most sweeping reforms we've seen in philanthropic policy, I think ever, honestly. I think it's fair to say that some of if these reforms came through, they would transform the sector so dramatically it's hard to even conceive of it. Just the shift to 5% in 1969, it was 6% and then reduced to 5%, had dramatic ripple effects. It changed the whole kind of it dramatically increased administrative expenses. And sort of the whole legal apparatus within philanthropy, and it really kind of the congressional investigations of philanthropy 50 years ago led to a period of about 20 years of kind of quiescence of a real reluctance of philanthropy to kind of assert itself as a political force. I think it's very likely that could happen again. This will be. It's hard to know. I mean, there's a bunch of different outcomes, but the degree of the reforms suggested is just dramatic, and it's sort of. I mean, there's something comic about it, which is when you look back over the last couple of decades. One thing which I always said it's almost it's always a good idea to bet against philanthropic reform. Like it's been so hard to get anything done. There's so much inertia and so many different forces kind of complicating it. So generally speaking, the reforms we've had over the last couple of decades have been very, very modest. And so to shift from a terrain in which we're dealing with the really kind of tinkering on the margins to these sweeping reforms. I think it's hard to even fathom the consequences.
Malcolm or Jean-Marc, do you have any reflections?
Obviously,
policy reform?
if there was an increase to the disbursement quota in the States, I think some of our politicians here would pay attention to that, and there's a kind of simplistic, like we're in trouble. We need foundations to fill in. That's the kind of the bailout discourse. But the overall frame that's so negative towards philanthropy, that's the one that concerns me, even though it's absent in Canada so far, is like, and maybe I'm missing it, Benjamin, but our foundation fighting back or taking public stance at this point, or they just, as James Carville said, play dead?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, this is what I was alluding to, the forces fighting back now are largely nonprofits. So, and nonprofits that are rooted in the communities of the legislators whose fates, whose hands they're in. And there's been, I think, a really impressive mobilization. It's been coordinated by an organization called the National Council of Nonprofits, and they've done a really impressive job. And I think that's sort of the lesson that we've learned over the last decade or so, that what's worked in defensive orientation against reforms that could threaten the nonprofit sector in the U.S. is mobilizing leaders in local communities. It's not tremendously effective to get folks in DC, focused on kind of DC lobbying. What really works is a wide and coordinated sort of grass tops effort where you really have the leaders of local communities who know the political leaders in those communities who can directly intervene. And we've seen that happening. I mean, when we're already seeing that happening for nonprofits, but also it's been pretty striking when the overhead cuts to research organizations. You had conservative politicians say, "Wait a second, that's gonna hurt my institution. That's going to hurt, the university in my home state." And so I think it's a really open question. What if the extent to which the anger will really start to galvanize folks at a very local level when they see the consequences at that level. How that relates to some large-scale institutions, including foundations, is a different question. This goes back to 1969. One of the things the foundations realized from that episode in the U.S. was they didn't have a built-in constituency. They saw the way that nonprofits reacted to that legislation, and there was this massive influx of lobbying on behalf of institutions from the communities. We saw this during COVID too. This happened. But what the philanthropic leaders realized was that there was no obvious built-in constituency for their prerogatives. And that's why they started developing a whole bunch of institutions in the US to build that constituency up and to build that lobbying muscle. At this point, that's an open question about how deep support for foundations or philanthropy itself as an institution will be. I think one very relevant question, which we haven't really touched on here, is the administration can target reforms to some extent. They can target it maybe ideologically, that might not withstand the First Amendment challenge. They could target it by wealth, and there's some correlation between wealthy institutions and ideology. But some of these reforms are going to hit across the ideological spectrum, and they're going to hit the allies and the antagonists of right-wing politicians. And right now, we haven't heard a lot of opposition from the right about how these would affect their own institutions. This is one of the things that's produced a stalemate in the U.S. system with reform more generally, because when one side proposes a reform, their allies say, "Wait a second, if you go after DAFs, that's going to hurt our DAFs, not just their DAFs." And so there really has been a kind of stalemate. It's still not clear the extent to which that's going to happen in the U.S. context, but that's something I'm very closely watching out for.
One of the fascinating things that I find observing this is that it hasn't got to Congress. The checks and balances in the U.S. system haven't been activated yet. The courts are starting, but they're a bit wound up. And it's exactly this, what about the farmers? What about the local, all of these stakeholders in every state, in every community will be directly affected and start seeing cherished organizations and a way of life being undermined. And back to the international, I mean, the Christian communities have been extraordinarily active and supportive of international aid, and yet here you have a government that may be aligned with some of these constituencies from a religious, social, conservative sort of perspective, but they have no interest in the rest of the world. That's going to be a point of clash as well. Because this whole, J.D. Vance discussion about, the orders of compassion, order amoris, is really, really an interesting thing, is that it's all about our clan that we are supporting, not this larger world. And it's really essentially an argument against basic human compassion and empathy.
That goes to the question you raised about international effects, and particularly in international development. Canadian international organizations by all accounts, are really feeling the fallout of the cuts to US aid. What can we do here? What are the implications for, obviously, we can't pick up all of the slack, as Jean-Marc said, but what do you see as a constructive response, doing the best that we can in light of those massive cuts?
So I discussed with a couple of foundations. I've got an extensive part of the portfolio and supporting international development, and quite often they're the second largest donor after USAID, US American Foundation, and it's simply impossible to say we're going to fill up the gap everywhere. So and some very tough conversation about where you close down with dignity, saying, okay, but this is, we'll support you to close down, not in 2 weeks, but over a course of a year. And those that you double down and invest more, and at a time where these cuts to aid are not only, I mean, the most dramatic coming from USAID, but the Nordic donors, we've seen now the UK that they increase to foreign aid, increase the defense budget is going to come directly from the foreign aid budget. The leader of the opposition in Canada is saying the same thing in terms of his strategy. So it's a pivotal moment. People call it the end of it, the end of ODA, official development assistance, how do you maintain institutions that do work, that are primordial for our global health and global welfare, responding to emergencies, to maintain those. And it's going to be a very, I think there's an opportunity for Canada because we need friends badly, to be active with a relatively small investment and visible in some of these some cases. I work in the Congo, and then they are working on one, like there are opportunities to be engaged and for Canada to make new friends. And I think with some of the governments in Latin America in particular, there's an opportunity there to kind of counterbalance what's happening. But I am concerned about the long-term prospect of, I mean, the aid system was far from perfect and failing more often than it should, but it still was saving lives. And now what's happening, that people will die, and putting every organization in that space to some very hard decision. Either imagine they set themselves in being smaller, still being meaningful, supporting meaningful action, and kind of that people to people dimension. I think that appeals to many of us, and keep these channels open. We need them more than ever, but in a world that's much darker.
One question that's arisen from the audience is, and this is probably for you, Ben, why aren't foundations speaking out more? And as a follow-up to Jean-Marc, what do you see happening in who can pick up some of the support for international aid? So a two-part question. Are foundations speaking out, and why not, and what happens in the international scene?
Yeah. I think there's a number of possible reasons for that. So one, the most simple one is fear. I do think there's a general climate of fear and uncertainty and not wanting to draw direct fire. I think there's so much has happened that I think it caught many institutions a little bit flat-footed, and there is a tendency of foundations to sort of have to, strategically plan before they speak. And so I think we're seeing there's a lot of internal deliberations as far as I know, but it hasn't necessarily translated into kind of very visible public leadership. I think there's been a transition in a number of major institutions in the U.S., leadership transitions that have led to a number of relatively new leaders in major institutions, and I think it's fair that some of them are just getting their own feet. I think and the last week we've seen some movement. So I think it's possible that there's that kind of a kind of a desire for solidarity that's now coalescing. But I also feel like it's fair to say that there's, from the nonprofit leaders I've spoken to, that there is a sense that there needs to be more, that there's a dissatisfaction with the level of public commitment. And so my assumption is that we'll be seeing more statements, more kind of commitments. Over the last week, there's been a number of foundations who have announced payout increases, for instance. I wouldn't be shocked to see some more of them. In terms of what's going to happen to foreign aid, I'm just not sure. I think I alluded to this. We haven't seen massive commitments from the leading foreign aid funders in the U.S. to step into the breach. So it's possible we'll see that. But one thing that I think that's the most important development. What we haven't seen is a kind of large scale public commitment to triage. I think it's very much a valid debate about whether or not that was something that we should say. Just from my own perspective, I've argued, in my own capacity, not in any other capacity, that even if you can't, that it's clear if philanthropy can't fill in the gaps, but there's a kind of false narrative between committing private funds and crowding out public funds, and I don't think that's how it works in a case like this. I think bold private commitments in a moment of emergency can be the basis for building a sense of the importance of these causes. That is the prerequisite for building public support for more government funding down the line. And so, but that's going to be a major issue. I think that's a real issue, and I do think there's a potential that organizations will have to look elsewhere for funding, and the U.S. sort of dominance in this sphere, I don't think will be entirely undermined, but I think it's going to look very different in the not too distant future.
There's a couple of inspiring domestic initiative in Canada, but philanthropic donors coming together, but working with government to address some long-standing issues. One is the climate initiative, the announcement for climate funding over $400 million by that was made through the Clean Energy Fund in November. The other one is more very recent, or the Prime Minister last week, $70 million philanthropic dollar to support the protection of and the management by Inuit communities of a fragile ecosystem in northern Canada. So there are some good stories we can point to where we can make a difference, can get, and as is helping putting deals together that would not happen otherwise. It's not most of the money. Most of the money is coming from government, but it's open, bringing people together, working through helping build the trust, and for government sometimes giving the cover of working with others that to take some more risk. Internationally, I've noted that Bloomberg has committed to replace the lost U.S. funding for the part of the small part of the UN that's responsible for the climate negotiation. That's a commitment of less than $8 million, so it's not huge. is the right role for philanthropy? I don't know, but I do know that we need these even though the climate progress does not look promising. The climate crisis is not going away, and we need to keep working on it. So the fact that Bloomberg has filled that gap publicly, I think it has not gone unnoticed, at least by me.
Ben started from the point of it's a change narrative, one of a lack of trust, of fear. This is a longstanding conversation in Canada, and it's something that has concerned me over the many years I've studied the sector, which is I don't think we've had an effective narrative, especially a Canadian based narrative, which means that the sector has been relatively invisible for governments, both conservative and liberal governments. There have been a few exceptions, but they don't appear in election platforms for positive or negative ways. They're just kind of invisible. So it's been, what, a 2-decade-old at least point about how do we create the right narrative? And this question also comes from someone in the audience of what kind of role should nonprofits, civil society play in society? And how do we tell that story? How do we create that narrative? And what would it be? And I guess the other part of that is who leads. Is it a moment to craft that new narrative? Malcolm, you mentioned this in your opening remarks too.
I think it is. I think it's immensely important. I mean, obviously, there's significant challenges because of the remarkable diversity and reach of the sector. It's the classic herding cats problem in terms of how do we craft some sort of narrative that's creates a big enough tent for all the various participants. But grounded in this, I mean, it is a bit of a, I think it's really important, this notion of the voluntary, the notion of civil society organizations, and not just depending on business, not just depending on government. You need to the earlier reference in terms of multiple points of light, you need positive actors that have public benefit. And so it's looking sort of, and it's hard because you can be, as soon as you get specific with a narrative, you lose the general. So trying to craft the narrative, in my mind, in terms of this independent citizen action, in terms of a civil society space, is very important. There's service components to that. There's idea generation. There's all sorts of different dimensions. But we need other bodies apart from business and apart from government where that essentially are advocating for good, broadly defined.
And this advocacy of strengthening the public good through civil society action. I mean, and in Canada, one of the 8 charities is a foundation. It's like, so raising resources to support the work of civil society. So and I think the moment that really we offers an opportunity to frame a narrative, I think, that could be more engaging and more real for people. The import vis-a-vis a totally polarized society and deeply divided society in the US. Despite our very real differences in Canada, we're nowhere close to that level of division and enmity there's us, and we've seen it in recent weeks, that desire to protect our notion, the notion, the values that are behind Canada, of decency, of inclusion, of equity. These are the core of what this country is all about. And I think regardless of of where we live and our political affiliation, there's support for that, and that that we don't want to leave community behind. And part of what the polarization is happening in the States is there's been so many people and communities left behind for such a long time, and that's part of that reactionary to that. So it's perhaps a simplistic analysis of what's happening in the US. We have some signs of that in Canada. We're not immune again, but I think there's a real appetite that says, no, we're all in this together, and to provide through the web of collective action, and it's not all governments, not all private sectors, citizen engagement, and this is a pathway to support that. And it's most effective when it's done in partnership with the private sector and government, but sometimes in opposition, that's okay too. So for of course, to have a dynamic and engaged democracy that we need philanthropy to protect the public square, for not only for ideas but for actual real collaboration on issues that are confronting our communities.
A very practical question, again, that comes from one of our participating audiences. How do we crystallize that? Does Canada have the equivalent of a council for nonprofits? How do we, what do we need one? What would be the value? And maybe Ben, you could speak to the role of the council in the US, but how do we build? It's great to say we're all coming together in a sense of nationalism, action, and protection of the sector. But how do we actually do that in ways that has influence on policy and beyond?
Well, I can talk a bit about the role of infrastructure organizations in the U.S., but I want to just quickly respond to the previous question. I think one of the major dynamics that we're seeing in the U.S. and really globally is the declining trust in institutions, generally speaking. It's been really one of the major dynamics responsible for a lot of political shifts. And for a long time, nonprofits were immune to that. They were the most trusted organization in the U.S. A couple of years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, that changed, and they started to be they started also to have reduced trust in them. In fact, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, they were subject to the largest drop of any institution. They've rebounded a bit, but they're no longer the most trusted institution in the U.S. And a big question that has consumed nonprofit leaders and philanthropic leaders is what to do about this. What should be the philanthropic response to declining institutional trust? It's a really uncomfortable position that philanthropic leaders have been put in that, and progressives more generally, and this is not going to be news to people, that progressives, and I'll speak in the first person here just to kind of put my cards on the table, that we are sort of charged with defending institutions. And that's a really uncomfortable position because for a lot of folks, we know, I mean, I think Jean-Marc talked about the foreign aid. The foreign aid system was not perfect. It was needed for reform. I alluded to this earlier in the sense that there are lots of reforms that people have been discussing in the realm of philanthropy. I think a really big challenge is how do you both defend institutions as important, as fundamental to a functioning society, while also kind of maintaining that reform posture. And that seems to be the place that the sector is at now. I think it's you could embrace this idea that we should just scrap the whole thing and have a kind of wholesale reinvention of what it means to have a nonprofit sector in the U.S. and to sort of almost buy into this rhetoric that everything's corrupt, everything needs to be torn down. And maybe that would lead to a better place. But I think probably the role that more folks are comfortable in is both defending institutions, defending the nonprofit as an institution, while also recognizing the source of the discontent and legitimate discontent, not based on misinformation or conspiracies, and doing both things at the same time. And to go back to the second question, I mean, in a sense, that's the role that these infrastructure organizations find themselves in now. The infrastructure organizations are at some level, like the council, like independent sector, they are fundamentally sectoral organizations, meaning that they are kind of trade associations for nonprofits. In that sense, they function like any trade organization out there. They like the trade organizations for truckers or doctors, or their job is to defend the institutions from attack and to promote their interests. But in some sense, these organizations are unlike any other trade association, because they also have this other mandate of being in charge, being charged with promoting civil society and the public good. And so they have to both defend the interests of their organizations at a very basic sectoral level, almost a transactional level, while at the same time trying to maintain this sense of, well, what is in the public good? Where are we falling short of that? In a way that you just wouldn't see any, there's no other trade organization that would have that kind of larger kind of public good mission. If you ask their members, they'd say, no, focus on getting me the best, concessions you can from the government.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it really, that's been a longstanding challenge from these organizations. They've done the best defensively. So they've done the best when they've beaten back reforms that were seen to be a threat to the interests of organizations, of nonprofit organizations. They've had a much harder time thinking affirmatively. So what would a good society look like? How do you get to some good place, a positive vision? I actually co-wrote a book on this with a colleague that I'll be happy to share with folks. But that's been a longstanding challenge. If there's a silver lining maybe on what's happening in the U.S., maybe this helps these organizations, these infrastructure organizations, think about that other component, because they're being forced to kind of confront at the very basic level. What are you here for? What are you, not just defending their own interests as organizations, but defending their place within larger civil society more generally. And so if Canada starts to think about its own infrastructure needs, I think that duality is one of the main ways to do so.
An important issue is will face our own election in a foreseeable future. We're getting close to time, and I want to leave you time for wrap up, but I have one last question I can't avoid. The DEI backlash. We're talking about it here, where it's sort of quiet in the sector. People say, it really is upon us. When I talk to US colleagues doing research in this sector, it's scary. They can't talk about anything related to justice or DEI for fear of their jobs. So Malcolm, maybe this question for Malcolm.
We have to.
Do you anticipate the same kind of, maybe not as dramatic, but significant backlash? And what do we do about it?
It's so interesting in terms of the fundamentals behind DEI and how important it is in terms of a more equitable, just, inclusive society. And that applies even in a corporate environment around making sure that you attract a wonderful workforce. They feel welcome there, they feel supported. And looking across various platforms that, there may be a bit of impatience around certain rhetorical flourishes or something, but there's not in my experience, and I mean that sitting in a large tower in downtown Toronto, as well as a lot of charitable not-for-profit tables, I'm not seeing that backlash. I think that there is this appreciation of how important it is, and how important it is, particularly with generational change. One of the key things, at the beginning of the pandemic, 23% of the Canadian workforce was identified as white. At the end of it, 27%, was identified as racialized. And at the end of it, it was 28%. What's happening is we're seeing significant generational change. And that's so very important. We can't look at this as politics. We need to look at it as our society evolving and changing, and making sure that we adjust appropriately. So moving off of this politicized rhetoric, and really continuing to evolve as a in most macro terms, a just society, I think is absolutely essential and needs to be continued.
And the latest polling, depends on how the question is framed, but it still shows 80 to 90% of Canadians supportive of diversity is our reality as a country. We've been doing a panel
It
of
is.
3 men, but
It is.
it's
Yeah,
a
yeah, yeah.
reality. Equity is the law.
Yeah.
We have federal and
Yeah.
provincial law that we all as employers and organization have to respect. And then inclusion, I really believe that's a core Canadian value. Going back to the 60s, and many often we fall short of it, but it's really part of our kind of nation building narrative that we aspire to truly be an inclusive nation. So yes, there's some incident like the Pride parade in Toronto has lost some fundings from apparently some the corporate sponsors have significant U.S. interest. They're afraid of the backlash in the U.S. That would affect them somehow. That's I don't know if it's true or not, but I have yet to perceive a significant departure from DI and the kind of, they might call it something different sometimes, but that embracement of diversity and that everyone be treated fairly by the law and the inclusion narrative is alive across the country.
I asked that question recognizing we might not be the most diverse panel, but
No.
as we wrap
Indeed.
up, one pithy thought, one minute each to reflect on where are we going in both the US and Canada, and what should we be most concerned about? Malcolm, I'll start with you, then Jean-Marc, and finish with Ben.
I think we're going to lose some things, and we're going to lose some good organizations. We're going to be six in the US, but a lot of that will come across the border. It's figuring out how we regroup and save, because we're not going to lose it all. And we're going to need to come out and change organizations, change funding models, figure out, it's not about shutting down organizations. It's figuring out the context that we really need to apply limited resources. And that's going to be one of the change. There's this perception in the Trump moment right now, this shock and awe, rhetorical excess, and just naked power moment where we think that we're almost blinded and stunned. But when we begin to work through it, I do think we're going to lose some stuff, but we're also going to work through processes to salvage, to reinvent. And I think that is important. It's not always going to be comfortable or satisfying, but it's not over yet. There's too many other people that care.
Jean-Marc, 1 minute.
Yes, and I'd like to thank you, Susan, for holding this panel. Philanthropic Foundation of Canada is going to continue this effort. We'll be announcing a partnership and rollout of conversation across the country to continue that. And one of our corporate partners is going to help our members think about the investment strategy. So there's some real live issues, but more broadly, we cannot allow to be paralyzed by fear. And there's a real joy and hope creation through action, through collective action, and that's the best of the charitable and not-for-profit sector supported by foundation. That we need to keep working on this, and despite I've worked in terrible settings in war zone across Africa. Like, I believe that this has been some of the most life-affirming moments of the power of collective action, and this moment is obviously created by the American electorate that knew full well with the elected, but a belief in the better angels of America. And Leonard Cohen in 1992 wrote a song called "Democracies," and maybe I'll just quote it quickly, like, past the reef for greed, through the squalls of hate, democracy is coming to the USA, the cradle of the best and of the worst. So that it's going to be our neighbor, like, and yes, we're going to go through a terrible time, but to the belief that we'll get through it, and the kleptocrats won't win.
Ben, last word to you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a huge amount more to say than I think there's going to be tremendous amounts of disruption ahead. I think the key thing to look at for philanthropy is whether or not it can marshal a kind of beyond a defensive posture, an affirmative vision that maintains its own, continues and to affirm the beliefs and values that it holds in the moment, beyond just defending and trying to resist. Beyond resistance, there needs to be an affirmative agenda that continues to be defended and promoted.
Thank you all. This has been a stimulating conversation in a period of turmoil, which clearly isn't over yet. As we conclude, I'd like to introduce you to our new PhilanthroThink Conversations series, which will be a series of conversations with a diversity of philanthropists led by our students and alumni that reflect on the meaning of philanthropy and the multiple paths that it takes. So watch for it and subscribe and watch for our next PhilanthroThink. Thank you all.
Welcome to PhilanthroThink Conversations, a new podcast series from Carleton University's Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership Program. I'm Megan Skivington in Toronto. On this podcast, we dive into the evolving world of Canadian philanthropy and nonprofit leadership. We talk about real challenges, opportunities, and strategies shaping the sector, both at home and abroad.
Bonjour everyone, welcome to the podcast. I am Daniel Lanting from Montreal here, and over the next few months you'll see several co-hosts just like me in the chair to help Megan steer the show. So this season our rotating team also includes MPNL student Emily Goodwin and Fengwei Yu, who you'll meet in subsequent episodes.
We're super excited to kick off the premiere episode with our very special guest, Lindsay Sherman Zakulin. So we really appreciate your support and hope you enjoy the journey with us. We're also excited to work with IG Private Wealth Management, a leader in helping Canadians achieve their financial goals. They are generously supporting the podcast, and we're excited to have them on board and look forward to bringing our listeners insights from their expert, Christine Van Cowenberg. And remember, if you love what you hear, make sure to subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify.
All right, Megan, are you ready?
Let's go.
Well, again, thank you all. That was a great session.
Thanks for the invitation. Much appreciated.
Likewise.
I was just reviewing questions as we went out. It's good to see the dialogue. Thanks, Susan. You're wonderful and facilitator and sort of framer as always. So really appreciate it.
Won't be the end of the conversation. There's so much ahead of us. Thanks all.
And
Bye now.
Jean-Marc, lovely to see you.